Freedom of speech as a universal human right has long been a source of tension between writers and authorities throughout history. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression." But who is responsible for preserving this right? In Western democracies, one could argue that the government has the responsibility through the courts and the rule of law. But what about authoritarian societies on the other end of the political spectrum? Who fights for the freedom of speech in unfree societies? The Western gaze of the 20th century deemed Soviet-era Russia as a society incapable of freedom. However, the Soviet Union would actually yield a prominent dissident literary movement of witty satirical writers. These dissidents published poetry and commentary in response to post-Stalin oppression that continued during the governments of Khrushchev and Brezhnev. In no other event was this revelation more prominent than in the 1966 trial of Soviet writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuliy Daniel. The Sinyavsky-Daniel trial highlighted the critical rights and responsibilities of writers under authoritarian governments. This pivotal moment in Soviet history highlighted that the universal right to freedom of speech comes with the responsibility to defend it, no matter the cost. Free speech in an unfree world. The rights and responsibilities of Soviet dissident writers. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the successor to Lenin and the second leader of the Soviet Union, succumbed to heart and lung failure at the age of 74. Since taking power, he'd spent the past 3 decades purging millions of dissidents, rivals, and innocents. The next leader, Malenkov, would serve exactly 6 months and 2 days before his ill-fated power struggle with Nikita Khrushchev, who would gain power on September 7, 1953. In spring 1954, Ilya Ehrenberg published his short novel, The Thaw, coining the next decade of political reforms and cultural movements during de-Stalinization. In 1956, Khrushchev would deliver his secret speech titled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences to the 20th Party Congress. Soon, his scathing criticism of Stalin as a diversion from Leninist socialism was being read at thousands of party meetings. However, Khrushchev's denouncement would be shadowed by the failed era of liberalism to come, as his government would only rebrand political repression to support his rise to power. The wide circulation of samizdat, or self-published papers, beckoned a cohort of dissident writers. With the Cold War simmering in the background, the Soviet Union engaged in an ideological power struggle with the United States to prove socialism's superiority over Western capitalism. The Committee of Public Safety, or KGB, sought to unmask thaw-era dissident writers who had been gradually unearthing and self-publishing taboo revelations of Stalin's reign. Many of these samizdat papers turned up overseas, where the Western press generated significant anti-Soviet propaganda. In response, the Soviet authorities engineered a new kind of crime: slander against the Soviet state. In 1959, Soviet writer Andrei Sinyavsky's The Trial Begins was published in Time magazine's Fantastic Stories under the pseudonym Abram Tertz. At the same time, another writer, Yuliy Daniel, under the pseudonym Nikolai Artsakh, was publishing short stories that imagined different outcomes of a post-Stalin society. Atonement, long heralded as Daniel's most significant work, uses motifs of art and religion to make universal commentary on political repression. The KGB honed in on their suspects by recruiting their neighbors as informants, poring over typewritten inconsistencies in samizdat copies, and hiding recording devices in their apartments. Finally, in September 1965, Sinyavsky, a senior researcher at the Gorky Institute of Literature, and Daniel, a war veteran and translator, were arrested. As word spread of the writers' arrests, a glasnost, or transparency demonstration in Pushkin Square, was organized through samizdat circulated by Alexei Volpin, a mathematician turned dissident poet.
And I decided to organize a public rally for glasnost, openness, which had only one demand: the demand for an open trial.
The Letter of 63, a petition of the USSR Union of Writers, called for the release of the two defendants. It argued that the trial itself had created more anti-Soviet sentiment than what had been initially published by Sinyavsky and Daniel. Legally, Sinyavsky and Daniel should have been untouchable, as publishing works overseas or circulating samizdat was not prohibited by Soviet law. Instead, the government was persecuting these writers for simply exercising their right to free speech, which was granted to them in the Soviet Constitution. Demonstrators in Pushkin Square brandished posters declaring, "Respect your own constitution." Lev Smirnov, the judge, had also presided over Stalin's Moscow show trials of the 1930s, which had been scripted, closed to the public, and spectated by a hand-picked audience. However, under the thaw, the classic pre-trial torture methods were absent. The trial was closed off to the public, and admittance was limited to those with exclusive passes. The Sinyavsky-Daniel trial would be the first show trial in which the defendants pleaded not guilty. Daniel would spend 5 years behind bars and Sinyavsky would spend 7. The Soviet government, and conservatives in general, viewed Sinyavsky and Daniel's actions as pure treason. Even some of their liberal, dissident counterparts agreed. These Soviet intellectuals argued that Sinyavsky and Daniel were turncoats, outliers in the literary establishment who had overstepped by publishing their works to a non-Soviet audience. Nina Voronel, fellow poet and writer, recalled some of the common reactions. "They ruined everything for us. We had gotten almost everything. We were on the verge of a real thaw, and they betrayed us. Now everything is going to be shut down." The trial was significant because by defending their rights under Soviet law, Sinyavsky and Daniel reaffirmed their right to free speech. By becoming the first defendants to plead not guilty in a Soviet show trial, they upheld their responsibility to preserve it in the face of an unjust legal system. The Sinyavsky-Daniel trial was a historic flashpoint for the rights and responsibilities of dissidents in the Soviet bloc facing governmental persecution. In 1969, a group of dissidents established the Action Group for the Defense of Human Rights in the USSR. The group captured international attention when it signed an appeal about political persecution in the Soviet Union and sent it directly to the United Nations, circumventing the Soviet government. Sergei Kovalev was among the founding members.
At some point, you realize that it's shameful to remain silent. And when you speak out once, you begin to understand the justness of the famous saying that it is easy and pleasant to speak the truth.
Just as Russia experienced the thaw, Czechoslovakia experienced the Prague Spring. On January 5, 1968, the people elected Alexander Dubček as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The next 2 years would be characterized by attempted liberalizations on freedom of speech, media, and travel. In response, over 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded the country, sending Dubček into exile. Many exiled Czech writers would be published by the Toronto-based 68 publishers. These writers continued to defend the sanctity of their right to free speech by publishing works that were banned in Czechoslovakia. Through the 1980s, Soviet dissident writers continued to face persecution. Still, one long-term impact of the trial can be seen in Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's reintroduction of the concept of glasnost as part of perestroika, a period of political reforms beginning in 1985 that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In an uncanny echo of Soviet history, Gorbachev's period of glasnost has been followed by the current period of persecution in Russia under President Vladimir Putin. The modern dissident movement parallels tactics employed by Sinyavsky and Daniel to evade censors and disseminate stories to a global audience. The 60s and 70s samizdat were dog-eared, battered, and full of typographical inconsistencies. Nowadays, digital files are the new mode of dissident literature. Books published as untraceable PDFs by Russian publishers with Western connections have garnered millions of views, raising awareness about human rights violations under Putin's rule. Modern-day dissidents like Alexei Navalny carry the legacy of Soviet dissident writers who fought their grim realities through satirical, witty storytelling. Like the Soviet dissident writers of the 60s and 70s, Navalny believed it was his responsibility to fight for free speech, no matter the cost. The Sinyavsky-Daniel trial ultimately highlighted that fighting for the right to free speech is a critical responsibility of all writers, especially in unfree societies where the rule of law does not prevail.